Hi there, thanks so much for joining for today's event. This is the latest in the collaboration between The Philosopher and Boston Review. My name's Anthony Morgan, editor of The Philosopher. For those of you who don't know the work of Boston Review, they are an independent non-profit public space for the discussion of ideas and culture. They publish free online essays several times a week in areas like the arts, law, philosophy, gender and sexuality, race and science, as well as 4 themed print issues a year. Today's event, The Political Theory of Algorithms, looks at the ways in which artificial intelligence and machine learning are reshaping the world. How are we to put democracy at the heart of AI governance? Our speakers today are Josh Simons and Lily Hugh. Fuller details of the events as well as speakers are available in the box below this video. This is just a brief summary. Josh Simons is a research fellow in political theory at Harvard. He's the author of the new book, Algorithms for the People, published by Princeton University Press. Lily Hugh is assistant professor of philosophy at Yale and author of the wonderful 2021 essay, Race, Policing and the Limits of Social Science, published by Boston Review. Thank you very much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy this event.
All right. Thank you for that kind introduction, Anthony. And thank you to Boston Review, The Philosopher, for hosting us and running this wonderful event series and reminding all of us about the value of philosophy and public engagement as well. And thanks, Josh, for writing this really remarkable book. And before, everyone should leave this webinar now to really read the book, buy the book. It's so fantastic. And I have to say, as somebody who's been in this area for so long, it's a topic that maybe Josh would agree, it feels both oftentimes overworked and under-theorized. It's really peculiar. And I found reading Josh's book, actually, that I was able to gain insight into all of the stuff that I had been nodding along to for years, but to actually have arguments elaborate in such great detail. And with such great, I think, a moral force, it's really special. So I just want to first start off by saying that. So Josh, I want to start off with the start of your book, where you start off with this vignette of an algorithmic system in the wild. And it's one that probably a lot of us might be familiar with, who are familiar with literature, which is the use of a system in the Allegheny County, which is a county here in the US, in their Child and Family Services Department, where the algorithmic system is now helping call screeners in their decisions about whether to pursue claims of child neglect or abuse. And you show us how the tool, right, this database predictive algorithmic system, might reproduce racial disparities, how it by its nature is going to prioritize certain interests of certain groups over others, how it embeds a notion of what constitutes neglect, what constitutes abuse, what characteristics go into an individual's risk for those kinds of behaviors. And you write in the introduction that how the system makes these choices a political matter. And you write that the central question here we should be asking is about how, quote, democracies should govern political choices that are made outside of the sphere of representative politics. And I think that's a really brilliant formulation of the problem and about the special nature of algorithms in this particular setting, right? Child and family services. And then you ask us to step back, right, from the specific matters at hand and from the particular machine learning system, the particular data, to ask this broader question about the conditions and the functioning of a democracy. So my first question is, I completely agree with that. I read that and I remember thinking, that's absolutely the right question. That's the central question. Why do you want us to zoom out to consider that question? What is it about this link between algorithms and democracy that it's so crucial for us to make in order to understand the nature of the problem? And that's often kind of missed, I think, in formulations that just use the word ethics.
Great. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much, Lily, for that kind introduction. And Anthony, to your point about Lily's paper, that paper was kind of the key to unlocking the first half of this book. So the first half of the book and the argument that develops is really, really very much built on the argument that Lily makes in that fantastic paper. Yeah, so I came to that formulation of the question by thinking about contexts in which there was no mechanism to surface the political choices embedding in building algorithms within institutions in which they were being built. So to take that example, the Allegheny County case, you have an underfunded, under-resourced, lack of expertise, public institution that is trying to build a tool with laudable goals. They want to reduce racial disparities, that was a stated aim, and they wanted to make sure that fewer kids were exposed to abuse and neglect. In order to do that, there was no way for them to build the tool without making choices about, as you say, and as it says in the intro, what constitutes abuse and neglect, who gets to decide, what we're prioritizing when we're trying to figure out where it is and how to stop it most effectively. But if you're a citizen of that county, how do you influence the way those choices are made? What's your relationship to the people who are making them? And what are the mechanisms that connect you as a citizen who is subject to the results of those choices to the folks making them and the rationales that those folks have when they make them? And that essentially takes you pretty quickly to the question of, you have representative democracy, you vote for your state representative, your federal representatives, but none of those people actually have jurisdiction over, either because it's a jurisdictional point or because in practice they don't have the time, the space, the capacity to hold accountable the people who are making the political choices about the design of this tool. And so that's kind of how I got to that question. The other thing I should say is my wife, Leah Downey, works on central banking and macroeconomic policy. When we started out in grad school, I was working on macroeconomic policy and she was working on algorithms and data, and we ended up switching about half the way through. And the thing we kept talking about was this question, because I think this question is actually crops up in other places too. You make political choices inside some sort of administrative system buried within the state or an administrative system buried within a corporation. The values and the interests that you hold close when you make or prioritize when you make those choices have huge effects on the kind of public, social, economic world that citizens live in. But representative democracy, the normal process of a legislature passing laws and having administrative agencies enforce those laws, it's just kind of irrelevant to the process of how that shapes up, or at least we've not thought nearly hard enough about how to make those things connect up better or differently or more regularly. So to sort of, the kind of three things I think about to kind of pull that together a bit is, unless you're thinking about how democracy should govern political choices outside the sphere of representative politics, you don't think about power, you don't think about institutions, and you don't think about governance. And if you don't think about power, institutions, and governance in the sort of space of governing predictive tools, algorithms, machine learning, then I think you're kind of missing all of the interesting questions that are thrown up by the political choices built into the design of these tools.
Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, and most of what you reveal to us is that, which is somewhat obvious, most of what goes on in a democratic society isn't like under the direct purview of your representative as you've elected on election day, right? And we have the entrance of low-level bureaucrats, of experts of all kinds, of various kinds of administrative institutional decision-making that is honestly, in a non-algorithm world, opaque to us and doesn't seem connected to what I do. No one's ever asked me how I think how family structure should be ordered. And in fact, I don't even know, nor was I even allowed to have input, it seems, in my local jurisdictions, a way of doing that. And so I think part of what you're pointing out is actually that there's this potentially salubrious effect, right, of the rise of these algorithmic tools in a democratic society. Namely, they actually render these explicit questions of value, explicit questions of institutional aims and goals and interests. They render them actually apparent to us, right? They render them actually, perspicuous with perspicacity when we didn't actually see them before, when they were kind of just in the minds of individual caseworkers or judges or so on. And so I think one thing I would like to hear more about is what you think then the opportunities then of machine learning or predictive systems afford us that we didn't have before, once we realize that these kinds of broad social political questions, in some sense, were always up to us, right? How families should be structured, how we as a society dole out punishment, how we as a society dole out forgiveness. These are questions that right now we have no idea, in some sense, what criteria are going into decision-making, parole commissioners, whatever. And we've just left it up to the individual discretion, decentralized decision-making, expertise, that, to use that word. And we actually have a point of intervention here, right, in the design of these tools. And that seems to me to be a really powerful and perhaps maybe an optimistic, maybe even utopian thought. So talk a little bit about that, about the kind of opportunities on the other side of the risk.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Yeah, a couple of things to say about that. I mean, one is sort of up top, just to kind of state this, and then we can maybe come back to it. I think it forces us to answer this really difficult question, or wrestle with it, about whether democracy is about control or about legitimacy. Because if you think that democracy is basically about legitimacy, and that's what representative institutions are for, and that the idea that there's any control power exerted in kind of steering a democracy, then there's not really a problem to be solved here. We elect a federal legislature, we elect a state legislature, they pass laws, and even if in practice those laws have no bearing on the political choices made about the design of algorithms in a corporation or in a public institution, that's fine, because they're still essentially authorized within the system that you vote for. But if you think democracy is supposed to be more responsive than that to preferences, it's supposed to care more about what people on the ground are thinking and feeling about the decision procedures that they're subject to, then you have a real conundrum, because the more that you can see the politics of the decision procedures that you're subject to, the more you are pissed off about the fact that you don't have any way to control them or even influence those who control them in a lot of cases. My kind of go-to example of this, and I think the Predpol case in LAPD is super interesting, and a lot of people have written about that well, is actually this algorithm designed in the UK called Ofqual, or it's built by Ofqual. And folks familiar with the space will have seen it, but basically what this algorithm did was in the middle of the pandemic, where they couldn't send everybody the exam papers to be graded by actual people. So they asked teachers to predict what grades they thought students would get based on their performance over the course of the year. And then they built an algorithm to adjust those predictions to what they stated was a sort of fair score based on past records of the school, the correlation between the predicted grades and attained grades. The problem is that in schools with predominantly disadvantaged kids, there's a bigger disparity between predicted grades and attained grades. All the millions of things that stop us working hard, having the space, time, investment, and so on, are more of a factor for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds than kids who come from well-off backgrounds. And so the fact that there was a bigger disparity in the past meant that disproportionately the grades of kids who attended schools with lots of advantaged kids were downgraded, much more on average than those who weren't from those schools. Now, the problem there is that if you worked really hard, way more than the average of your school, or if you were an outlier in the kind of background that you had in that school, you were disproportionately punished by that algorithm. Right or wrong, what it did, and there's like a reasonable argument about what the right way to build that algorithm was, what it did was really sharpen that every time you build even a normal decision procedure that's executed by humans to adjust a grade, you're making an assumption about how the past attainment patterns of that school should have bearing on an individual's grade and therefore their whole life chances. And that made the politics super obvious to those kids. They thought, how dare you, faceless algorithm, assume that just because the past results of my peers that have nothing to do with me are different to the past results of that school's peers, the kids who've attended that school in the past, why should that affect my grade? And that in turn produced this argument about power, who gets to exercise it, who are off-qual anyway. People ask that question, who is this faceless regulator we've never heard of? So I think that the more algorithms shine a light on the fact that political values and interests go into building algorithms, the more you will get this kind of feedback into a demand for control that the standard institutions of representative democracy right now doesn't really satisfy. And my, to your, you use the word utopian, which I think is, it's always good to pause and like ask that question, even if it's hard. And I guess, it would be something about, it would stop politicians and kind of bureaucrats in the old Weberian sense, so in both companies and public institutions, getting away with pretending there's no politics and stuff where there's loads of politics. They wouldn't be allowed to do that anymore because citizens would say, hey, there's politics there. I want to say in that.
Absolutely. No, and I think that is what's so surprising in some sense. It's a repoliticization of or a denaturalization of what we've just taken for granted. Like we've just kind of thrown our hands in the air and been like, well, obviously, like I can't have a say in the way that the state organizes families. I don't have a say in how we should be thinking about mercy in our criminal justice system. I don't have a say in terms of how our higher education system should plug into, how they can operate against a background of social inequality, but then off-qual, Compass, all of these cases crop up and you realize it's not a choice between machine learning model A and machine learning model B, right? It's actually a choice between how we make decisions more broadly, including human system A and human system B and human plus machine system C, and that's always been the case. And it's actually been a kind of mistake to think that we're dealing with a totally new regime of politics. We've always been in this world, and machine learning just really serves to highlight and serves to serves to bring out the kind of what we previously might have abnegated in terms of our responsibilities as a democratic polity, right? And I think that is, I think, again, it's a painful process. It's very painful, as many of us have experienced communities realizing in some sense, but it's always been there. And I think this gets us to the kind of next question I want to ask about how you think of the kind of question of humans versus machines in decision-making context. I feel that that's oftentimes been the framing, right? Like we've been asking, well, on the one, the machine does this well when it comes to their predictions about recidivism, and the human judges do this well when it comes to accuracy or so on. But you can make the comparison across a number of metrics, right? You can ask, like, who does better, the machine or the human, with respect to racial inequalities? Who does better, machine or human, with respect to kind of consistency in decisions? And so how do you think about the question of comparison? Do you think that's a red herring? Or do you think it's actually is helpful? We should be thinking about comparisons when we're thinking about the role that these systems ought to play in these sorts of institutions.
Yeah, and that, to just jump quickly back to your first point, because I think it is a good segue. The kind of crazier version of the utopian thought is, mass representative democracy from the, 18th century revolutions onwards is fundamentally a passive thing. You delegate masses of legitimacy and control to elected people, and then they in turn delegate it to all kinds of places. Well, maybe we live in a world, or we're moving to a world. I mean, I don't think this is right, but I think it's kind of a helpful thing to have in the back of one's mind and to think about, where we should be going. Maybe we move to a world now where actually, these kinds of algorithms are built at a level that is actually much more tangible to a lot of people on the ground who experience things like, off-qual, predpol, and LAPD, the Allegheny County algorithm. And so they ask, who gets to do this? And it creates a kind of political awakening. At one point I had this like ancient and modern thing in the book, and it didn't work, and it was kind of wrong. But like, it's still, I think, a helpful way to think about what could shift. But as always with these things, it's not baked into the way that the technology is going to be rolled out. It's a question of how we respond to it and how we organize and how it ends up affecting politics. And like so the segue there is, I think that one of the reasons why it is a red herring, what does machine learning replace, is it itself kind of depoliticizes the question by sort of making it a binary, should we, shouldn't we? And when has any, the relevant decision in the Allegheny County case, or the predpol case, or actually the predpol cases kind of was a bit this, but in most of the cases that we think about and know about and have all written about, is not should we, shouldn't we, but it's how. How is always the most political question. And the binary, people used to do this, should algorithms do it? should machine learning do it? Should we use data to have them not do it? Kind of distracts attention and energy and focus, and also scholarly attention from the how question. And the how question there, at the level of designing the thing, how should we build the thing if it's going to do this? But also the how, and the how should we govern those doing the thing, and then the institutional questions that kind of flow from that. So I think a sort of better question is, what are the features of building in data-driven prediction systems into a decision procedure, either just having those or having those with some sort of relationship with humans? What makes them distinctive and different? How are they, and what are the implications of those differences when you're talking about prediction or data or machine learning versus people? What are the implications of those differences that matter for thinking about power and democracy and governance? And I think when you think about it like that, there are basically two key things. One is about the kind of control or intentionality you can exercise, and the other is about the scale and to some extent the speed. But in any of the cases that we've talked about, take Allegheny County, by building an algorithm, you have to decide how the decision procedure is going to treat the information that it gets given. You can't not. You build the thing, and so you train it, you define a target variable, you write the algorithm, in various different ways. You have to tell the machine what it's supposed to look for and what it's going to do with what it finds. And that control, we all make decisions all the time based on, hell knows what. It's a combination of emotions, reason, some complicated interplay. You don't intentionally exert the same kind of intentionality on a broader decision procedure of which humans are a part as you do when you build an algorithm to do something, to make a specific kind of decision. And then the scale point is just, if you have one bad judge, one judge who's making judgments on the basis of some particular criteria, that's a problem. You need to solve that problem. If you have one bad algorithm and it's replacing 1,000 judges, then you're in real trouble. And so I think these elements of control and scale are better heuristics to think about when we're asking the machine-human comparison, where the question is not, a versus or a either or. It's more a how should we combine these given these distinctive features of what it means to use data to make decisions.
Yeah, that's great. And I absolutely agree. It is, and it's never been an either or, right? Everybody always points out it's even in cases where these tools are being used, they're never just completely issuing decisions on their own. They're always being plugged into an existing pipeline of decision making. They're always being worked in concert with humans. So even as a matter of not just framing, just like accurate description of what in fact is a possibility right now, that's not really on the table, and for good reason, I think, as well. I think the question of how is gets us to the question of actually how, in the sense of what kinds of experts do we need? You point out in the book, and also you yourself are aware of many hats, that we have these big gaps in expertise and in the roles that different people play. So people in technology who work at Google, people who are like me, who are inside of my office in a very old building, and people like you who are on the ground, who are also, are in our capacity right now as public intellectuals. So all of us kind of occupy these particular stations and have our expertise suited to particular arenas. And when we actually think about the how, all of us need to be obviously working together. And I wanted to ask you this because, you're kind of in some sense the best suited to this, because you've worn so many of these different hats in lieu of the fact that we don't have perhaps the kind of ideal team of people doing this quite yet. So you've made this turn, right, from political theory to politics, and also you've been inside these companies. And one thing I want to ask about is how you think about the division of labor. I imagine you still think there is a division of labor, right? It's not like I should abandon my station and just go work at Google now, and that nobody should be in this station because I'm useless, even though sometimes I definitely feel that way. So how do you think there's one question, which is what do you think we in the academy, as it were, should be doing? I take it that you don't think we should be doing more mathematical definitions of fairness, or maybe that's not the only thing we should be doing, or arguing about those. So where do you think more theorizing or analytical precision, scholarship, whatever, would be useful. And what do you think are the kind of major hurdles of efforts that try to go beyond the groves of the academy? And where do you think, again, are the major places where there's promise, and all, digital governance more broadly?
Yeah, great questions. I think in some ways that question is in what are we all going to do about all this stuff? Like, it's actually, it's not just a who do you vote for question, and it's not just a, what's the right answer question. It is like a how are we going to organize all of this in a way that makes what each of us do and what each of us specialize in most productive and impactful. So I think a few things, maybe going from kind of top level down to, in particular, questions of scholarship and academia that I think are vital and kind of undervalued, in particular by the institutions around academia. So I think that in general, I think this goes for political economy and how you think about economics. I think it goes for computer science, algorithms, data, and I think it's going to I think it goes for bioethics and like life sciences. It's going to become more and more a feature of public debate in different ways. We need to get better at building within institutions that have time and patience and money, teams of people who learn how to talk to each other that come from different worlds. And big plug for my the center that I'm a fellow at, the Edmund J. Safra Center, Edmund and Lily J. Safra Center in Harvard. During the pandemic, we academics were all sat, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, thinking, what can we do? How can we help? Some of us have knowledge, and how does that knowledge plug in? And we came up with this model of, bringing together scholars, policy experts, and practitioners, and sort of defining a really concrete question and then having a very short time period in which we try and make progress in answering it. It's not the perfect model for all cases, but being innovative in the way we structure teams and sort of allocate our time in doing that, I think is super, super important. And it's super important that institutions that have the capacity to do it, like Yale, like Harvard, devote their time and energy and resources into providing a space to do that. So that's a kind of top level thing. I think we need to get better at teams that bring together folks who learn how to talk to each other. In the end, that book is the product of talking to Cynthia Dwork, Danielle Allen, these huge professors in their own disciplines, but also grad students like you and me who were wrestling with, these different disciplines, how to get them to talk to each other. And I would never have been able to write that book were it not for those environments in which those folks could talk to each other. So I think that's probably the most important thing. If I had to list like three things that scholars in philosophy and sort of political science theory would think about more in relation to algorithms and data, it would be power, institutions, and something like time. I think in many cases, understanding how questions of power seep through the design and integration of algorithms and how those are manifested institutionally and how much time matters to almost everything in politics and democratic theory are difficult. They're not quite, it's hard to make really clean analytic contributions, and therefore that kind of space of contribution is often closed off. I won't rant about that. But I would just say one thing about the sort of, sometimes I think, you kind of said this just now, it can feel like conceptual contributions don't make a difference, but actually weirdly, having done the whole journey now from academia into policy and now politics, actually the really good philosophy papers that make a really fundamental, clear conceptual distinction or contribution or reframe what you thought a word meant or clarify the bounds of a concept, they are unbelievably valuable to everybody else working in the space. And actually that includes practitioners. They won't, very rarely will they ever read it, but it seeps through in all kinds of really, really fundamental ways. And I think that kind of contribution, what is race, is not to be underestimated. It's super, super important.
Great. Okay. So you talked about power, and the second half of your book is on what you call infrastructural power. The kind of the power that is exerted, that is wielded by Google when Google designs its PageRank algorithm to sort the search results that we get, that each of us individually gets, perhaps, or the power that's wielded by Facebook when they determine how the newsfeed, how things are going to appear in newsfeed, what appears, what does not appear, when you post something, who is able to actually receive that content. And you make these are kinds of power that have deep implications for democracy, because they structure, as you point out, they structure our public sphere, and they organize our entire, as you say, our entire information ecosystem. And it's pretty clear that the fact that these two companies, let's just say starting there, are entirely kind of have their grip on these huge aspects of condition that feature in the conditions of a flourishing democracy, that might be actually anathema, right, to being able to create the kinds of the kind of space within which we can exercise our democratic capacities. Now, of course, all of this is not only made possible by, but it's to kind of bring in the politics here, to bring in the power here, but made possible by, but actively buttressed by legal regimes, right, that allow for extensive digital surveillance, market dynamics, for instance, that incentivize companies to create products to generate, let's just call them social pathologies, right? Addictive products, encouraging fragmentation in terms of the news that we get, the voices that we hear, who we speak to. I really like the image actually of everyone with their little radio headsets on in the public sphere that you call, yeah, exactly. So it's this broader political and economic system that is in the background, and we're really loath to intervene on that. And then now we have these private corporations that now set forth the substantive set of values, and that these kinds of technologies that now govern our shared lives. So, I'm now going to do the thing where I say a lot of this traces back to like the real guts of liberal capitalism. And I know you don't discuss the problem in these terms in the book, but you kind of, it's not even that I see glimmers of it, I really see gestures at it when you talk about the value of political equality, the necessity of political equality, that democracies are founded on this kind of ideal. And when you talk about democratic utilities, when you talk about how we should govern, given this fact about newsfeed and PageRank, how we should govern them, how we should think of them as democratic utilities. And you really point out that in order for us to actually confront these social I'm just going to call them social pathologies, because I really do think that they are, that are persistent in a system like ours, we really got to go back to the drawing board potentially and reconceive, or conceive anew anyway, what the place of these companies are, their products are, the power that they wield, whether those ought to be in a society like ours. And so my question is, how deep do we have to plumb, right? Like you pointed out, the kind of power that these companies wield with their products is just run so deep. And I take it that a little slap on the wrist, right, or better notice and consent laws, a fine, isn't going to do it. So how do you think about this as someone working in politics, seeing that there's a kind of deep connection of the dynamics of capitalism and capital accumulation, digital surveillance, the data ecosystem, their ability to build these products on the back of that regime? Do we have to possibly kind of deal with the elephant in the room here, is what I'm suggesting?
Yeah, no, how deep do we have to plumb? Great. I mean, basically very. In a way, the way I came to think of this, and I talked to Shoshana Zuboff about this when I'd asked her to read it and thought, oh God, maybe I should have read her book and not written this. Is in a sense what this book is supposed to do is pick up the question that surveillance capitalism ends with, which is, okay, how should democracies think about what they do to solve this problem? What should be their kind of orienting focus? How should they what values should guide them, and what problem statement are they actually trying to solve? And in a way, I basically think you're exactly right that this is really about, especially the second half, but to some extent both even, it's about, a democracy versus capitalism. It's about tension between the two. And in particular, the ways in which, capitalism, the tools that capitalism can build for itself can eat away at democracy. So I think that that's right. What I wanted to do in this book was say, okay, if we stop thinking about capitalism as our main frame, not because it's not important or not because it's what's really the driver here, but because it doesn't actually tell us what to do, where to go, why, what's it all for, whereas I think democracy does. And I think democracy provides, really quite sort of concrete, colorful values like political equality that we can argue about the manifestation of and the institutionalization of, that have huge implications for capitalism. But like, if we stay wedded to those starting points, I think it helps us guide through the morass of, constitutional law in the United States, questions about the scope of different federal institutions and so on, which actually in the end kind of aren't that important in a certain sense. Or at least if we're thinking clearly about what we need to do in this space, we have to put them to the side for a moment. So for instance, that question, in a way, the question that I think companies like Facebook and Google generate is, what is the nature of a private company that builds the infrastructure of the public sphere? Or what is the nature of a private firm that influences the public interest, to use the old, early 20th century framing? That's a really deep question about capitalism. But the way we should answer it is by thinking hard about democracy, not capitalism. What do we want from a private company that is shaping the very conditions that make democracy possible? What do we want it to do? What do we want it to be like? You really, I think, can only answer that by thinking clearly about democracy first, about questions to do with publicness and publicity and shared spaces and shared information and so on. So I think that accepting that you're going to have to plumb pretty deep, but doing it by thinking first and foremost and always about democracy and its different conditions and aspects and values and institutions helps you know what you're doing down there in the deep weeds of, like, equal protection doctrine or, the First Amendment. You can get so far into these that you can do a, super great 45-minute seminar on the history of the First Amendment. But when you just pause to ask yourself, why, what's it all for and where's it all going? You need democracy as a starting point, not capitalism, to help answer that question, I think. But yeah, none of that is to say it's not super deep. I think it really is.
I think that's great. I think maybe summarize that, it's maybe the capitalism lens is helpful for the diagnostic, and maybe the democracy lens is like the keeping the eye on the prize. That's the North Star. That's the normative ideal to which all of our reforms, revolution, whatever, are aiming at. And I think I completely agree with you. If you lose sight of that North Star, of that normative ideal, we can quickly become unmoored from our ultimate moral, political commitments to each other. And I think that's what's kind of one of the things that's so inspiring about your book, which is that you never lose sight of the horizon, even while our eyes are in the gutter. Right? Like we always have one eye on stars, one in the gutter. Like that's what we're doing at all times. And I think you're absolutely right about democracy being that our unwavering commitment to democracy being a kind of motivating force that we don't just get when we're in the purely diagnostic mode or the purely kind of negative mode of diagnosing, even if it's super important, the capitalist dynamics that generate the social ills that you diagnose so powerfully in the book. So I know we have about 15 minutes left. So I figure maybe we'll take some questions from the audience. Anthony, I mean, I can talk with Josh forever, but I want to give other people the opportunity to.
Cool, thank you. Well, yeah, there are lots of questions coming in, and I'm trying to do my best to sort of climb them. I thought we'd start with a very short, kind of juicy one from Steve. I thought I'd put it to you, Lily, because we've probably heard some examples from Josh on this front, but what is the most shocking example of an algorithm gone wrong that you have heard of? Algorithms gone wrong.
Oh my gosh, most shocking example. Well, Josh has, do you have any, Josh? I mean, I feel like this is bad because it's going to just continue to feed into the dichotomy of the human versus algorithm setup here. I mean, it is very, there's the shocking, there are many different kinds of shocking. I guess there's the standard cases that are now, I think we've become inured to, but we shouldn't, given how horrifying they are, which is the really banal cases of policing based on, predictive crime-based policing. I know this is a case that many people are inured to because it's been, very much kind of at the heart of a lot of exposés on algorithms. But we should not we should not take it lightly that we deploy, at least in the US, I would say almost paramilitary forces in terms of the arms that these oftentimes quite independent police forces have to communities that are, to put it very lightly, extremely at the suffering from extreme social deprivation, and that we are dealing with that in part by a justification of rational policing or predictive policing based on markers of just social deprivation. And the way that we are handling that is by sending, I would say, again, paramilitary forces to protect effectively, I think to wreak a lot of havoc in communities that are already experiencing a lot of social deprivation. So for me, that is a more a shocking thing that I think, again, a lot of us have become inured to. Josh, do you have any on your list?
No, I was going to go for exactly the same example. I mean, just to pull out one feature of it that's so scary that I think is actually much more present than we care to realize, but is really super clear in that case, is the reinforcing feedback loop doom spiral, that happens. You have an algorithm that uses past data to predict where to send police officers. You send those officers there, they observe more crime, especially public crime. And that itself has racially disproportionate effects on where crime is recorded. That gets fed up back into the model, and then the model predicts that crime is disproportionately likely to happen in the same place. Police officers get sent there, they observe more crime, and people have modeled this in various ways, but it's terrifying. You quite quickly get police officers only in that place. That happens everywhere in our society and economy. It's a really super common thing. You cannot understand racial injustice without thinking about that basic structure of problem, but it's true of other types of inequality and injustice too. And data really makes it happen faster and bigger and worse. So it's a kind of structure of a problem that I think it's super useful to use that predictive policing case to help notice in loads of other contexts.
Thank you. So there's definitely an emerging cluster of questions that I guess would be largely built around the question of accountability. So to combine questions by Mario, Jumana, and Will. Mario asks, well, I'll go with Jumana's because it's the shortest version, then fleshed out. So Jumana asks, how can algorithmic decisions ever be seen as democratic when their processes are opaque? Isn't it a kind of mathematical dictatorship? And on the same front, Mario asks, can these problems of accountability be tackled? Is it just a matter of digital literacy, or is it about requiring a high level of transparency to algorithms used in government? And then Will references a kind of thing called newer black box AI that doesn't make its processes clear, and asks about whether they can be interpretable in the light of this. So it's a kind of cluster of questions about transparency, accountability. Josh, do you want to kick that one off?
Yeah, sure. Rather than lay out like a full theory of all that stuff, I'm going to be a little bit selfish, but hopefully it'll be more interesting, because I have wanted to ask Lily about this for the last, 2 months. But we've both been super busy and I haven't actually written the email yet or sent it. So there's this whole debate, ChatGPT-4 and the kind of buzz that it's generated has posed this question: is it possible to have accountability when you integrate something that is, in terms of the processes that produce things that look recognizable, like sentences or essays or instructions, completely incomprehensible? There's no way to articulate that logic that is useful or meaningful. And in fact, if you try and articulate the logic, you end up distilling it down into things that are actually sort of defective. That, this is kind of what tech companies do when they say, why am I seeing this? Oh, because you're a man and you're, about to be 30. Well, that's revealing unuseful things. And then the worry is that, has gripped folks recently. Well, what if we live in a world where there are very human-like outputs, like text, that are actually produced by a massive prediction exercise, where you can't ever talk, engage, reason, have a conversation about the rationale with the system that produced these very human-like outputs. is accountability possible in that world? And I used to kind of not worry about this because I would think about simple machine learning models that would spit out a prediction of a particular, probability of, recidivism or this particular child being at risk of abuse and neglect. And I kind of thought, well, it's just not important if that thing explains its rationale. It's about what outcomes you want to achieve. But there is something scary about a world of chat GPT-4s that are all junior lawyers in our economy, where you can't ask why and you can't ask how. So yeah, I'm sort of interested to know, because I'm interested to know anyway, but also I think it is prompted by that question, like what Lily thinks is sort of about this. Is accountability possible in that kind of world? And is there something about explanation and justification and reason giving in an iterative way over time that is impossible, that makes accountability impossible?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things I always wonder is what is accountability? Like, why do we want that? There's a concern, which is like, I want to be able to, like, there's something deeply alienating. Like, I'm trying to talk to you, hear me, and I can't get at you. Like, I can't appeal, like Josh, you and I are having a fight. And I feel like no matter how bad the fight can get, I can say like, Josh, look at me. Like, I am a person. I'm appealing to reasons, and you are too. And you can tell us, there's this kind of recognition, mutual recognition that doesn't seem possible maybe when I'm talking with the machine. And why is that valuable? Well, oftentimes, like so many of the kind of central functions in our society, or when I'm engaging with you or engaging with a machine, I need to be able to advocate for myself in some regard. I need to be able to assert my agency, and I need to be like recognized. And it seems like I can't do that. And if accountability is something like that, namely that I can make the other person on the other side of my interaction be responsive in some sense, in the right way to me as a human person, it does seem like that is a genuine worry. And I wonder whether we're losing something. I think I do, in the machine learning systems that just can't be the kind of thing that can understand me as a person. No, there are other avenues of, accountability. If maybe we mean something weaker by accountability. Maybe I just need to be able to appeal a decision. Well, we can do that. Like, I mean, certainly we might not be doing that now, but we can certainly build in the guardrails or build in the various kinds of off-ramps to algorithmic decision making, so that I can appeal a decision, or so that I can be able to give the machine new information about me, or maybe I can get a human to explain the decision to me. There are various things I can build out around a system to gain the ability to self-advocate. But it seems like the thing that I constitutively am not able to do is get the machine to recognize me as like an originator of moral claims. And if we mean accountability in that second sense, then yeah, that is very worrying to me in terms of the opacity and the ability just to kind of interact.
Thanks so much, Lily. Josh, do you want to pick up on anything, or should we move to another question?
I mean, I could talk about this for hours with Lily. I think it's that relationality element, it's part of why do we care about control? Well, there's like a power and a freedom type concern. If it's not me, why did Rousseau care so much about it? Well, partly because if it didn't, if the thing that's happening didn't come from me and my will in some sense, that's a real, freedom-based problem. But there's also something more kind of emotive, I think, and relational about it. And that's the thing that I think Lily's picking up on that scares people. But it's not well picked up in the kind of analytic debate about what accountability is, I don't think, or at least in a lot of it, accountability. So anyway, I'm going to stop talking there. Yeah.
Thanks. So inevitably, these questions have this kind of scope, which means Josh will say, "Oh, I could talk on this for hours." But I guess as we've only got a few minutes left, we're going to do like something like a quick fire round, insofar as that may be possible. So Michalis asks about the attempt to regulate algorithms and the question of ethical expertise. what's the link between the attempt, say, by the EU to regulate algorithms and whether or not there is sufficient ethical expertise and what kind of ethical expertise that may need to be? So again, massive question, 1 minute or so to give it your best shot. Josh, do you want to give it a go?
Yeah, I mean, I can be super, I think, direct about this one. So ethical has to not mean you know what the right thing to do is, because having been an ethicist, Lily and I both worked in that kind of world where you're an ethicist and you're asked by companies to like say what you think. We don't know. I have no idea what the right thing to do is in lots of those cases. What matters is power, who gets to decide, and who's held accountable for what they say, in my opinion. So I actually don't think we need ethical sort of expertise to regulate and to do some of the things that need to be done in this space. What I think we need is better mechanisms for surfacing the politics, the values, the interests that are buried in these things. And that does require people with translational capacities to describe, to explain, to understand, to distill. Ethicists are often very good at that because they're thinking about technical domains and they're thinking about moral and political questions in them. But it doesn't have to be ethicists. Some folks who are not ethicists, some politicians are really good at that. Some policy makers are really good at that. So I think it's that translational bit in order for people to exercise their opinions and explain their preferences about the politics at play, rather than needing ethicists.
Thanks, Lily. Any thoughts on the role of ethics or experts in ethics in the regulation of algorithms?
My God, not this one in any case. I think that Josh is completely right. It's not, it's very disappointing to learn that an ethicist should not tell you what is right or wrong, but perhaps they can give you the tools to be able to better analyze the question or frame it in a more transparent or perspicuous way.
Okay, so the final question, which I think is a great one to wrap up, is by Ian. So basically, you've made the distinction about not wanting to kind of place the binary of algorithms on one side and humans on the other, but Ian's just asking fairly kind of cuts right to the core. How does the governance of AI algorithms differ from what we've had in the past governing the elaboration of public policy into administrative procedure? So Lily, do you want to start with that one, and then we'll finish with Josh? Again, massive question, just do your best in the time we have.
Oh my gosh, how do really, well, actually, I'm going to give it to Josh, because I think Josh gives us a really good, in the second half of his book, he points out how there are these similarities between the kinds of, the kind of public utility thinking that we have had in the past about railroads, about electricity, and so on, how some of that has been applied, or some people have been attracted to that framework as applied to key internet or digital, let's say, technologies, but how there are distinct differences in these cases that should lead us to go in a slightly different direction. So I'm going to just set that up for Josh, because I think he has such a great answer in his book.
Wow, thanks. That's in Britain we call that a hospital pass, which means you just give someone the ball just before they get taken out. Okay, in super distilled form, I think what we have to think about is the function of these things. What are they doing to whom? And what is the institution that they're being used by doing to whom? What is Facebook and what's it doing to people? And if you think functionally, rather than in terms of pre-existing categories, this is the First Amendment institution, this is a private company, who cares? What's it doing and why does it matter? And of course, we have to care, but just start with that question. I think that what's different about this space is it opens up a world of interesting complications to the category. If you ask that question, what's the function of this thing and what's it doing? It opens up a world of interesting implications for constitutional law, for the way that you think about the connection between public policy, elections, and representative institutions, for the way that you think about the administrative state and what it is and how it should be structured, and a million other things beside. But I think the most important thing that democratic utilities were sort of, the conceptual innovation that lurks behind them is to think, okay, we don't care if this is a private company. What matters is what is this company doing for us and our democracy and how we relate to each other. And if it's doing stuff that is super important to the very possibility that democracy keeps existing, we have to regulate it and govern it in a way that reflects those states. Because if we don't, it's accidentally, not because anyone sat down and set up the company and said, I'm going to destroy democracy, but because the things that the company is trying to do have the effect of eroding the foundations of democracy. And I actually think this is potentially happening in more cases than we care to realize. And I think algorithms can really sharpen. I think that's really what lurks beneath the debate about Facebook, TikTok, and others, is that that's kind of what they're doing in some ways. And we're forcing ourselves to ask the question, well, if that's what they're doing, what should we be doing with the governance of these companies?